I really wish I could have recorded your mono. I should have, because the moment when you were in the middle of saying it, I was like, oh, geez, it's like perfect poetic wording that resonates so strongly, I think, with so many people. Um, so I would say, kind of, this is at least my kind of take on what's going on these days. Like macro level, if you are like super into politics or economics or whatever, it is not great these days, right? The trend line is really negative. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's collapsing, right? In terms of like old orders and structures and all that stuff, institutions, trust is eroded, all that stuff. So at first glance, the world looks really negative at the moment, right? If you kind of think about like, oh, where's this all going, right? And rightfully so, because we don't know the answers, and it's scary when everything falls down. What I also think is true though is on a much more micro level, right? When we're talking about individuals, I have never seen so much kind of, I don't know what the right word is, like increased awareness of exactly the stuff that you were just talking about, Davis. Right. And it's not as well developed as what you've just articulated. Like maybe they've only got 25% of that, but they got this feeling that something's not right, but they don't know what to do about it. Or maybe they
Yeah.
got half of what you just said, but they're going to get to 75 and they're going to get to 100. Right. And so I see many more people at a younger age increasingly questioning basically the cultural values and the model and the promise, which was always kind of bullshit anyway, right? About, this is what's going to make you happy, right? Still plenty of people fall for that because the system kind of works that way and it doesn't give you much in the way of inspiration otherwise. But I have increasingly noticed in many different places, and it's not just in North America, Davis, it's in places like China and South Korea and a bunch of other places. Like people really are kind of wondering about, particularly young people, like, is this really what I want to do? I kind of think no, right? So I do see like evidence of rebellion at an individual level, right? In many, many places. I think the real problem though is it's one thing to rebel and reject, right? And you articulated that actually beautifully without realizing it, I think, and being like, wait, if I'm not going to do this high achieving track, then I guess I'm going to be in a cardboard box and be homeless, right? And that's actually, I think, what the messaging is in many
Yeah.
ways, right? Right. It's not like it gave you this like kind of reasonable plan B if you did. It's like, no, you're doing this because you don't want to be that, right? So it's to sort of scare us into staying on that track. Um, and so when you have a society that's designed that way or built that way, yeah, I mean it's scary to think about the alternative, and then people get kind of lost, and some people do go down that track potentially, right? I'm thinking about the lying flat movement in China. Did we
Hmm.
ever talk about this, Davis? Yeah, this guy who basically like wrote this manifesto on Chinese social media, and he's just like, "F this! I'm not doing this anymore." Right? But he's basically living on subsistence wage, right? And he's kind of withdrawn from society. There are very unhealthy things about that road too, right? Which is why I wouldn't advocate that as much as I dislike, the same things you dislike. But the weird thing is that the world is actually not this zero middle ground kind of world. But if you don't know anything else, like that actually is often what you'll default to just due to lack of, like, I don't know what else I'm supposed to be doing. So cardboard box it is, right? Like that ends up being the thing. And yeah, no, this is really helpful actually for me because one of the things I have been toying with now that some of my personal things have started to go more rear view mirror is what is it that we can do to help people realize that there is something in the middle, right? And maybe even better. Like, I mean, wouldn't it be great if it was a world where, yeah, it's not that clearly defined path that everybody knows, and yeah, not everyone will completely understand you. But what if there was a way that you could actually be not just happier, but actually even wealthier, right? Or even like, I mean, these are almost crazy thoughts, right? If we think about, well, cardboard box or this,
Yeah.
but one has to wonder, right? Like, what is in that middle space? And I think most people have so little idea or has such incredible trouble envisioning it. Like, we really need to kind of help people, like, at least see what that is, right?
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that because so I have like I made the decision to, it's like, okay, so I could have moved back to Canada and applied right away for a director level position at like, a Canadian company, manage procurement, and then go and buy zippers for a jacket company and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, that doesn't really feel like that's what my life needs right now. And I spent 2 days researching how much money and how much time and effort it would take for me to become a long haul truck driver.
Hmm.
And like I went relatively deep. I researched different chairs. I found out that you can option stereo systems, a bunch of other stuff, like what the hours would be like. It's really like a 3 month training program, and then you can start to drive. You can't do like hard, like long hauls, but it's like you can actually get put rubber on pavement after about 3 months. And it was like, okay, so I at least have some sort of a backup plan. That backup plan doesn't exactly look like what I was doing before, but I know that what I was doing before wasn't making me happy. So I actually went and searched for, it's like, okay, what's pretty much the exact opposite thing of sitting in an office plugging away at a computer for 14 hours a day? Is it's driving a truck for 12 hours a day, listening to music and, smoking cigarettes and doing whatever it was that I had wished I was doing. But once I figured that out, and once I figured out that it's like, oh my God, my like, oh shit branch I grab before I come like hit the ground isn't that bad, and it's very possible to turn into a reality. It let me go and do all these weird things afterwards. And I still think back to that, and it's like the craziest thing is it's like if I actually imagine me being in a PhD program or like working or doing something else, I know I'd be there and I'd be wondering what it would have been like had I not pursued my dreams, but just been a fucking truck driver. And that
Hmm.
to me has been a really kind of eye-opening experience, is like going through the process of, it's like, okay, like I've spent a lot of time looking for jobs and applying to jobs and interviewing and stuff like that. And I spent 2 full days like actually researching that. And it opened me up to being like, okay, so what do I actually want to do? I want to tell stories. I want to travel. I want to meet people. I want to have conversations and write. And it's like, okay, well, let's try that for a bit. And if that doesn't work, I can always go and be a truck driver. And that isn't exactly the middle that you're talking about, but I do think that it's important to understand that the, it can't just be, to your point, like being a doctor or being homeless, that there's this middle ground
Yeah.
that I think, and in the middle ground, like throughout that spectrum or whatever you want to call it, like every you can find something that fits you so perfectly that it just makes sense. And I think that, like Scott Galloway always sells this, like, don't pursue your passions, pursue your proficiencies or whatever you're good at. Because everyone who tells you to pursue your passions made hundreds of millions of dollars doing iron ore or like smelting or in import export, and then went and pursued their passions. And I'm like, I don't think the goal needs to be to become a captain of industry and then go and study jazz or something like that. I think it can be as simple as just like, try being a truck driver, try doing this, try doing that. And like, there is this middle ground where we don't have to convince ourselves that the only path towards happiness is a more expensive watch or a nicer car or an apartment on a higher floor, which goes back to what I was saying before about like appropriating happiness from people who have, in my view, nothing, but in their view, everything. And it took me a while at that meditation retreat in order to like reframe it and not go, what a terrible life this monk lives. And instead, I was like, after a few days, I started looking at him and I was jealous. I was like, the monk is living a kind of life where he is like, I'm 32 and I'm relatively strong. I can't sit cross legged for 30 minutes without moving. And, this guy is sitting there for hours every single day, not moving. And I'm going, oh, that's what it's about. So, and that's what I think the middle ground is about, is it's like, okay, I forget, I think John Sexton, who used to be like the president of NYU, said it's like you can pursue your dreams as long as you temper the things that you buy. And that was like the advice he gave to his daughter. He's like, oh, you want to go and study art? That's fine. Well, maybe don't buy X, Y, and Z, because if you do, you're going to have to go and get the kind of job that you can pay for X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
And that's what I saw in Thailand, where I was going like, these people do exactly what they need to do in order to be at peace. No more, no less. And it's a beautiful experience.
Yeah. No, and it's I mean there's a reason why why we have retreats to go to a place like that, but they don't have retreats to come to a place like, the middle of capitalism in New York City, right?
Yeah,
Not for finding happiness at least, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
that's a different yeah, that's a different kind of thing. No, that's so true. It's interesting. This reminds me, like years ago, before I ever did my first really kind of longer retreat, I did an overnight one, and part of it was they had a session where you could just talk to a monk and just ask him anything. So we're all like in a circle around this monk,
Mhm.
and you could ask him anything, right? And this monk, I don't know, he was probably like in his mid 20s, and somebody asked like, "Well, do you find it stressful to be a monk?" Or do you feel like that you're just missing a lot of stuff and you wanna go out, into the world and kind of live like everyone else? And he said, I thought about it, but actually the outside world's pretty stressful, right?
Yeah,
Was kind of what he said. Like he saw the outside world as a source of stress, not the world that he was in, right?
yeah.
And totally makes sense, right? That's why we all go do these retreats.
That's yeah, that's so funny. And I specifically because, like I said, I want to talk to you about the exam because like that was a life-changing experience. And I think it has something to do with like how the monk answered that question and how like you would have approached it or I would have approached it as a question, like asking whether or not this is stressful. And it's the the monk or like anyone who like chooses to live that sort of lifestyle, whatever you want to call it, they have to find everything within themselves. And I think
Yeah.
that like it's actually for me at least a much more difficult journey. Like I think it's a lot easier to just DoorDash a couple hamburgers and forget your worries for a day or for
Yeah.
for an afternoon than to actually have to sit there in silence and go through the ups and downs, the rising and falling. You feel the emotions and all that kind of stuff. Um, and that to me was essentially like what this 21-day experience culminated in, which we called it the exam. But essentially what it is it's 72 hours of social isolation. Like not talking. It's you're not allowed to see anyone other than the monk who meets with you for 10 minutes every morning
Yeah.
and gives you your day's task. You still eat the 2 meals a day, but they bring it to you in your room. So you're in one of those little rooms, and at this point, you're doing an hour of walking and an hour of sitting, and then as short of a break as humanly possible. And the goal is no sleep over 72 hours and as
Yeah.
much meditation as possible. Like I said, because I did no research before going, I didn't know about this until David, who was prepping for his, explained to me what he was doing. And then that sat in the back of my mind until the teacher had a conversation with me about having to do the exam. But they break it up in tasks. So like the first day is 1 to 1, like an hour walking, an hour sitting, and then you break for a little while, back and forth, back and forth. So I did 19 hours of meditation the first day. And when I wasn't meditating, that was like a 20-minute break here, a 30-minute break there, stretching, eating, whatever. Um, and then the second day, it changes a little bit because that's when you start to nod off during sitting meditation. So you do less sitting meditation, but more walking meditation. And that's when it's so funny. It's like I was wearing my step counter the entire time I was there. And it's like, you think you're doing 10 hours of walking meditation. Like, oh my God, you must have gotten, how many steps did you get? I was getting like 1,500 steps a day because
Mm.
you're walking so slowly
Yeah.
when you're doing it. But by the end of the second day of my exam, all I could do was so in the room, and you know this, like there's the screen, and then there's these two little handles that you can wind the
Yep.
window slats up and down. And I was just standing at the screen holding onto those two little handles, trying to take some of the weight off of the balls of my feet because my legs were shaking, my back hurt, and I was just holding onto these two little handles. And then the third day is essentially just do 1 to 1, but it doesn't have to be an hour and a half. It can be like 15 minutes, but do as much meditation as you can without falling asleep. And so I did 19 hours the first day. I did essentially 17 and a half hours the second day. And then the third day, I did like 12 hours or maybe 11 hours, and I'm sure I dozed off during sitting meditation. And I talked to the teacher about it, and he's like, "That's not sleep. That's like deep, deep meditation." And
Mm.
it's like, but it felt like sleep. And he goes, "Yeah, but that's fine." But the experience I had though was, I mean, it's so weird, and I talked to you about this, where it's like the sounds of the jungle that are nearby, like come and permeate the walls, and it's like you feel you're in the room and you haven't left the room other than to like use the bathroom. You feel as though like you're now one with the jungle, and like all the sounds are in and they're coming into your body. And I was doing sitting meditation on the second day, and I'll remember this for the rest of my life. Is it's my eyes were closed and like my mouth was closed and I was like deep in an hour-long meditation session. I'm not too sure what minute. It could have been minute 5, it could have been minute 55. And honestly, the hardest part for me about the entire experience was no one was prevent like I think that that 21 days of silent meditation would be a lot easier if they just locked you in your room.
Yeah.
But the problem is, there's you can leave at any time, and
Yeah.
it's like this huge battle, and there's this huge battle of you like actually staying, and you climb upstairs, you climb downstairs, there's going to be a bunch of red trucks waiting to take you back to whatever city's nearby.
That's right.
And like it's that process in that battle where you actually look at yourself and you go like, oh no, I'm committing to this. And I think for me at least, the beauty of that experience is it requires commitment, and it requires you to actually show up and be an active participant. Even though you're trying to not think thoughts, you're trying to quote
Yeah.
unquote quiet your mind, and everything else is it's an active decision. Whereas everything else, it's an active decision that you have to make again and again and again in very small ways. Whereas everything else is it's just like you take an Uber to a clinic and you get shot up with ketamine, and then 2 hours later you come back from outer space and you talk, and then you go on tour and you tell everyone about how life changing it was.
Hmm.
Whereas meditation is a very different experience.
Yeah.
And honestly, for me, it's harder to talk about because it's more personal, because it's just you and your mind.
It's just you and your mind. It's a slightly different, I think they're all variations on a theme, but everyone's journey is actually quite unique fundamentally, right? Even when you talked about the dreams of your friends versus you, I
Yeah,
mean, there's a reason why they're manifesting differently, but they're all kind of overarching theme quite similar, right?
yeah, yeah.
Um, and and so it's really, yeah, in this culture where basically we don't look inside at all, and nobody wants us to, right? That's kind of the baseline.
Yeah.
And so, and then of course it's kind of scary on some level if you kind of force yourself. I mean, we all go through this, right? The first days, they're not easy, right? When you're looking in there, and you'd said you'd had some, there was a lot to go through in the first couple of days, right?
Yeah, yeah,
When you were doing it. So, who wants that, right? But on the other hand, like there is something really good about that process, even though it's not a dopamine hit, right? I mean, there's something about that that's very, very profound and meaningful. And dopamine hits, ironically, don't end up being profound and meaningful, right?
yeah,
Like nobody talks about how doing a cocaine thing did their life or changed their life, right? It's not
yeah, yeah,
along with any other things, right? So yeah, it's a very different kind of thing, right? To experience. I'm so glad you went. So based on everything that you told me, kind of the different experiences you've got, actually the people you've met, right? So it does seem like you've met a couple of people, kindred spirits on a path, right? Maybe is
yeah,
the right way to say it. And how easy is it to meet people like that? Well, in everyday life, not that easy, right? You have to go someplace to look for, people who are kind of in the right time and place for that kind of thing. So no, this is absolutely fantastic that you've kind of had. I knew you. I was very curious. I knew you had to have had something because having done it myself all the way till day 11 or day 12, like I knew even from that there was stuff that would definitely come if one pushed it all the way to 21, right?
yeah,
if you want to do the purely silent version later, you totally can, right? If you want to know what that experience is like, but just do it when you're ready, right? And it's funny. This is very interesting because you've done a great job of kind of adding more color about that space. Now, because now we have a language, you and I, about how we can describe this gap between I've got to be an overachieving whatever it is, doctor, lawyer, banker, like
Hmm.
whatever it is, or I've got the cardboard box, right? And you and I both intellectually understand that this isn't an outrageously false framing, right? In some sense. Um, and now what you and I are doing is we're trying our best to kind of take guesses, maybe smart guesses about what's in the space in between, right? And hearing you talk, Davis, you've got some presumptions about like maybe it's just about trying, maybe it's just, and I think there's a philosophy around that, right? Like this is because whether it was actually always intended or not, right? The way we have structured our society is to literally make this a big dark space that like the messaging is like there's nothing there, right?
Yeah.
Because if it was totally illuminated what was there already, you would not see so many people trying to overachieve down a road where they're not happy, right? Like
Yeah.
that would not be what you would see, right? It's the fact that there's a dark space there and then no one wants to go to the cardboard box, right? The homeless option. That's not appealing either, right? Totally understand that. What's really fascinating to me when we're having this conversation, and this is the first time actually I've ever had this conversation with someone, like we're actually referring to it as this space, right? And you talk about the space between, God's finger and then Adam's finger, right? I mean, there are many ways to kind of conceptualize this, but this is kind of the great unknown. But I actually can't help but wonder because my job is to be an educator, right? And so I kind of have to pay attention to, well, how good a job are we helping people to kind of see what's in that space? And the answer is we're doing a horrible job. So,
Hmm.
is it the case that that space is dark, not because of a romantic, beautiful unknown? Of course, to some degree, that's got to be true because everyone's different. Or is it just that we've done such a terrible job that it just looks dark and therefore we have to resort to like almost religious or philosophical belief systems in order
Yeah.
to articulate that it's worth pursuing, right? And I got this terrible feeling sometimes that it doesn't even need to go that far. It's just that we've done such a bad job that it feels so mysterious when actually it probably isn't. We just needed to kind of get people from a young age up and running to at least illuminate that a little bit more. And then, then think about like, okay, what are the risks, right? Now, when everything is dark in that middle, risks look infinite, right? Or like it looks like suicide, right? That would be sort of the most infinite maybe risk you can think of. It's like I got 100% chance of dying or a cardboard box if I do that.
Yeah.
Um, but this is based purely on the fact that you can't see what's in the middle, and there's no effort that's been made by and large when we're growing up in the school system to kind of help explore that middle. Now, there might be some exceptions, right? You and I are sort of business school products, so maybe we're being particularly kind of boxed away from seeing that. But I don't think so. I have a bad feeling that actually maybe it's not as much rocket science and mystery and religion and philosophy as we think. It's just that like it's just so black because we haven't even bothered looking down that road. And then there is a point where it does become what you just said, right? It is the sort of almost like mystical kind of thing, but I almost feel like that's just because we at least need to shine the flashlight in that direction first, and then you can get to that part, right? But it all looks
Yeah.
like that because we've even the most rudimentary stuff we've kind of skipped over, and therefore it must seem very like brave and mysterious and all this stuff. And there's something about that bothers me, right? Not about what you're saying, about the fact that it resonates that you're actually describing this as this like great unknown, which I think is true, but that's partly because we haven't helped anybody to try to explore that, right? So by definition, it's going to feel even more unknown and even more scary
Yeah.
than it should be. If I think about the path and the choices that you've made, Davis, to your credit, right? And this is nothing against your classmates at NYU, but you you're part of a minority of students that I still talk to from those days who made a conscious choice at some point to kind of do what you wanted, not not kind of fit the mold of, and you actually did start off with the mold, but it didn't take long for you to realize, like, nah, it's not for me. And so all of you guys, I would say what separates you guys is all of you guys had some baseline level of courage slash, we can say it's mixed with a degree of dissatisfaction of going down that road that might maybe it's harder to tolerate, right,
Yeah.
than it might be for some others, or maybe some of your classmates have ways of dealing with it just to kind of deaden the or numb the pain or the dissatisfaction in ways that you're just not willing to do, right? Because you've got a principle that you can't compromise on with that, right? And that's not to judge anybody. It's just, we all kind of choose our paths, right? Risk reward. And so you're now walking down this path, and I think it's very cool to watch, right? Because this path isn't just about like, hey, what is my job title? What am I going to do? And, like, how am I going to make the money, right? These are very practical types of questions, but of course, they're completely inadequate to kind of answer the big thing, right? And what you told me about your meditation retreat, and actually as part of kind of your broader efforts, like you're absolutely in exploration mode right now, which is what you should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and I think that's actually sadly more unique than it really should be. So there's a bunch of people that are in your situation that should be doing exactly what you're doing. But I remember this, like my first job in banking, when a bunch of us got laid off, what was the first thing that virtually every classmate of mine, who got laid off was doing, was they were looking for another bank to go run to as soon as they could, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that's fine if you know that that's the right answer for you and you've discovered that that's your path, but that couldn't possibly be true, right? For everybody who is doing it. And so, and I think that's a real mistake, actually, for many people. And, that is what it is. But it's to your credit that you haven't gone down that same road, right? It's partly what makes our conversations really interesting, to be honest, and why we still kind of keep talking. This is what I really love seeing. I think there's a selection bias, right? A lot of the students who still talk to me from the NYU, my days at NYU, do tend to be like you, right? In the sense that they kind of made a conscious choice to go off the beaten path, right? And it's been great actually watching all of you guys kind of evolve in this way.
Yeah, but so, and then not to like get too deep into the philosophy behind who you keep in touch with versus who you don't, but I'm sure that if you look at why listen, like a lot of people go to business school thinking specifically about ROI. They think about how much money they made before business school, how much money they're going to make after business school, what the cost is. They figure out what the free cash flow is going to be for the rest of their working lives, and they figure out, okay, what was the actual return on that investment of time and effort and money. And then there's others that go there for an exploration. I mean, I'm sure you remember how I was dressed when I went to business school. It's like
I do remember.
I had showed up in day one in full explore, like that was an experiment, and it was full
Yeah.
exploration mode. And I feel like a lot of the friends that I made at Stern specifically were also there exploring other ideas. The people that I still keep in touch with were there exploring. And it didn't have to be like so philosophical and whatever as like some of our conversations turn into, but it was like just an exploration of what can I learn in order to do something that's more interesting, which I think is a much more beautiful reason or a much better reason to go to business school than a specific what is going to be my exact ROI. And if I go to Darden instead of this other place, then my ROI is going to be 2 percentage points higher. And that's who I keep in touch with. So I assume that that's probably who you keep in touch with too. The people who went looking for something a little bit different than just some sort of a multiplier on their future earnings.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. Those students tend not to be the ones that I'll hear too much about later, right? I mean, it totally makes sense, right? It's nothing against them either. It's just the different sort of focus, different kind of
Hey,
path, right?
and listen, like if my path ends up at a dead end, I will be reaching out to all of my much more successful classmates and asking if they're hiring senior manager level positions when I'm in my late 30s. But until that happens, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think I'm not so worried about your situation. And here's why. So in this kind of phase, I think what always needs to be happening, right, as a general rule, like regardless of your age, right? Because I think there's multiple points in life where this can happen. I think to be really candid, I mean, I think there are people in their 60s or 70s that also have this moment. But that version is often like, hey, I gave up all of myself to be a great, whether it's a mother or father or like spouse or whatever. Like I had all these duties and I never had any space for myself. And now I finally get that space, right? I mean, so it's not that, if you had the other path and you made it all the way through to that age, that like everything was just fantastic, right? That I don't think this is how life actually ultimately works most of the time. So, but what needs to always happen in these moments, whenever they hit, I think in any age, is you absolutely have to be in exploration mode. And it is usually a mistake to go back and do exactly the same thing you were doing before if it did not satisfy you, right?
Yeah,
Because there is
yeah,
no reason to think that that life is going to make you any happier. And there's every reason to think that it wouldn't, right?
yeah,
And so, but in the middle, this is where it always gets messy, right? Because everyone has a different way of doing this. And societally, we actually don't have any kind of institutional thing for people in these phases of life, even though this happens to tons of people all the time, right? This is the irony. So you're kind of left either lost and then you just stay miserable and you go find the next thing and you kind of live the same life you had before, but nothing really changes. Or you go exploring, but you kind of need to figure out how to do that because we don't have tremendous amounts of structure, right? And so one of the things that I find, this is nothing against that author Elizabeth Gilbert, but the woman who wrote Eat, Pray, Love, right? When she goes off to what, Italy for the food, Bali for her spirituality, or was it India maybe? And then, right, exactly. So this book becomes a bestseller because it resonates so strongly, but it's also basically, hey, let's pick the three countries based on stereotype that fit my needs and go. Not a terrible way to do it, right? But the fact that that was kind of mind blowing and kind of so kind of like laying the structure out, and people reference that even now that I know, tells me kind of like we really don't have a whole lot to kind of offer people for what they should be doing in these middle phases, right? When they're kind of transitioning. And we
yes,
probably should do a better job of that.
yeah, yeah. No, to be honest, it's like when I tell my story, there's a pretty significant chunk of time that someone references that book, period. It's
Yeah,
I haven't read the book or seen the movie,
me neither.
but I know it well enough through conversations where it's like, oh yeah, no, I went and did meditation, and then especially like when I was in Italy, it exactly the same thing. It's just like, oh, are you going to Naples? Are you going to go to this restaurant? And I'm going like, yeah, yeah, I am, because I am on my eat, pray, love journey right now. So
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, now I'm realizing after I gave I think I had mixed up the countries and what she was looking for because I haven't read the book. But anyway, you get the idea that yeah,
oh,
there are these journeys that we need to go on. But you know what? In fairness, there are many people, probably many more people that should who don't, right, go on these, and I think this is the bigger tragedy, right? Is at the minimum you should go do something.
so all right, it's I'm gonna try to ignore that we're recording this just because it's
I can
I'm
stop, by the way.
no, no, it's I listen, like I said, I trust you with it. It's just you're watching real time my brain work, and you know that I'm better at writing things down than I am at speaking them out loud. But because you said it, it's like I'm on my exploration phase, and you're like, well, we don't really have a good like there's no framework or there's no structure for going on adventure. And I mean, kind of by default, yes, that's true. Like by definition, there isn't a framework for going on an adventure. Although, so what I've been doing lately is I've been rereading like really old stuff. And so what do I mean by that? I mean like the Epic of Gilgamesh and not the Iliad, but like Homer's Odyssey. And those are two adventure stories. And it's like so strange to me that we have to go thousands of years back in human history in order to find um, archetypes of adventurers, and but then also some sort of a framework for going on an adventure, and or like some sort of a framework for exploration, some sort of a framework for leaving home. And it's like, okay, so Odyssey is about Odysseus's return to Ithaca, but then some of the most famous poems in the world are written about that epic poem. So the Tennyson's Ulysses, or Ulysses, whatever, the made weak by time and fate, but strong and will distract to seek to find and not to yield, that poem. And then Cavafy's Ithaca. And both of those are about essentially just Odysseus trying to make it home to Ithaca. And Cavafy's poem, Ithaca, is about the journey. It's not about the destination. Like he says that, like, I hope that by the time you reach Ithaca, like, you are old and you are tired. And I hope that the journey takes a very long time. And I hope that you collect all these really wonderful memories and these, it talks about Poseidon, it talks about angry Poseidon and Cyclops and a bunch of stuff like that. But then it also talks about like a Phoenician trading station where you get like wine and pearls and jewels and fragrances and stuff like that. And I think what the framework comes down to is it's like you'll never like, okay, so some sort of a destination or an end goal is a really nice thing to have, but it's really only important in getting you out the door. But once you're out the door, the universe and life and whatever has
Yep.
train schedules, whether or not there's a power outage at London Heathrow and all of a sudden it's like, well, I guess we're not going exactly where we thought. Like, life kind of takes over. All you have to do is kind of find the courage to leave that front door. And like I said, the Epic of Gilgamesh, he had a reason for leaving. Odysseus he had a reason for leaving Troy and trying to make it home to Ithaca, but I guess he also had a reason for leaving Ithaca in the first place and going to Troy. But it's like, as long as you make that first step, every subsequent step is easier to make. It's not necessarily an easier step, and like shit gets thrown in your way. You have to solve problems, the money becomes an issue. But I think making that first step is the hardest one. And as far as the framework is concerned, I think it's, for me at least, it's been more of a it's been more of a change in belief system than it has been knowing what I'm doing. Because like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I have a faint idea of where I want to end up. But I mean, our next conversation could be completely different, and I could be pointing in a completely different direction. But that change, how my belief system changed, was what I was saying at the beginning of this chat, which was like letting go of my belief in my ability to achieve happiness because I haven't been able to quote unquote achieve it in the traditional sense of the word achieve, and instead just trusting that the universe will push me to make decisions, and I will be given opportunities almost on a daily basis to either be a good person or be a bad person by the choices that are laid out in front of me. And as far as I'm concerned, whatever adventure I've been on in this exploration has been guided by my want to build connections, my want to tell stories and hear stories, and my want to essentially experience things that I hadn't experienced before. And
Yeah.
so, as far as a framework is concerned, that's been mine. And it's been have some sort of a reason to leave. And then once you have that reason to leave, just trust in the universe's ability to give you choices. And when you show up and you make the right choice, not necessarily the easy choice, it's really interesting where your path ends up leading.
Interesting. You call it framework. That's one way to describe it. I think another might be just guiding principles, right? Like you just have these principles that you're going to work with, but you have no idea exactly what the circumstance is going to be. And then you go forward. That first step, this goes back to, I really like kind of the way we framed it earlier, right? You got the set path, you got the cardboard box where you're homeless. The first step really requires you to believe that there's something in the middle that's worth the effort,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Without knowing that that's true, right?
yes, yeah,
And that's kind of the number one thing. You've got to get past your fear, you got to get past doubt. You have to kind of, you actually, if you really think about that long enough, you actually need a certain belief system that runs deep about how the universe works, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you actually need to believe something more than just it's either this that I hate or the cardboard box and a life of homelessness. Like you actually need to believe that that is not how the universe is kind of actually designed, right?
Yeah.
Regardless of what's being messaged to you, which is
Yeah.
actually that. Um, and you need to believe that somehow either it comes from yourself, like I have the ability to figure it out, or it's a narrative of the universe is going to show me like what it is if I just take the steps through that door, or maybe a combination of both of those sets of beliefs, right? But you also need that, because if you don't have that, if you don't think you have the capability and you don't think the universe is going to show any, you don't really have a reason to go do it, to be
Yes.
honest,
Yes.
right?
Correct.
So these are kind of just baseline. You need this to kind of take just the first few steps out into the dark, into that middle, to see what's there. And that's a very interesting, I hadn't actually thought about that before, because I'm going to be honest. The one thing I haven't actually thought about in great detail is what fundamentally separates, let's say, you and some of the other students that I've talked to who really have deviated. Um, but they're walking down very interesting paths and more authentic paths in many ways
Hmm.
compared to everyone else. So, I don't think it's intellect. I don't think it's, a whole bunch. If I looked at kind of socioeconomic demographics on paper, I don't think I'd see huge differences of any kind.
Yeah.
Right. I always put it up to sort of like just personality differences, but not ones that I could articulate. Right. But now that we're chatting about this, I do think that fundamentally it's maybe a mix of like how much do I really hate this, right? And maybe some people can't tolerate it, as well as others. But more than that, you also need the belief systems that I just mentioned, right? Like you got to believe that in that middle space that there is something, right? And that you're going to be able to find it, right? Whatever beliefs are going to help you kind of like believe that, because it takes certain assumptions in order to kind of make that belief. Like that's what I think separates all of you guys. And then maybe sometimes this wasn't as true in your case, but sometimes people just also need to hear from someone like it's okay, like you can go do this and it's okay to kind of go pursue it. And sometimes it just takes one person to say that, and then someone's off, right? They're going to go do
Yeah.
that, right? Because they're ready to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is really interesting. I need to think about this more, because there's a series of challenges, right, Davis? If we live in a world where falsely, right, and let's assume that it is definitely false, that it's the high achieving miserable path or the cardboard box and homelessness, what is stopping everybody from exploring the middle, right? When already their internals are saying, okay, this isn't really working, and I don't want to do the homeless thing, right? So there's already an indication that this isn't really kind of working, but I think that's the most common state, right? It's not that people are ecstatic and then, are only discovering later that they're unhappy. I think pretty quickly people kind of realize like, oh, this is not amazing, right? Or I have to like live this way. And so then the question is, what stops him from then going into the middle and starting to explore, right? And I've had lots of these conversations, and funny enough, I have not actually thought deeply about like all the many different things that are obstacles along the way on a micro level, like the fundamental beliefs you have about the world. And I think that
Mhm.
actually I think that's really huge. Um, because partly what you're telling me, Davis, tell me if I'm wrong about this, right? I'm going to go out on a limb here. The whole story about your meditation, right, as well as your broad exploration, your experiences over in Rome, right? All these things, what I think I'm seeing you do is actually starting to kind of not disentangle. I think you're actually starting to change your belief system in some way, shape, or form, right? Or it's not necessarily as you just full on bought all those things before, but you didn't have a different belief system necessarily to replace it with. And so you're kind of in this middle ground where you're like, oh, I don't really want the old ones. I'm kind of getting rid of some stuff and I'm finding new things because it's not like someone's handed one to you, right? Because you're not that type of guy either. You're not the type of guy where like someone just with a lot of charisma will show up as a leader and say, "Hey, Davis, like this is what you should do," and you say, "Yes, I will go do that." Like that's not your personality
So
type at all.
listen, the reason why I'm smiling is I think every single conversation we've ever had, you ask me some version of this question. And I
Really?
know that because the first coffee that you and I ever had, we were talking, and I was talking about like wanting to write a book, that kind of that was um, a fiction that helped me explore some of the things that I was worried about, or like some of the questions that I kind of spiral about all the time. And you asked me what my values are. That was the first question and I remember writing it down in my planner at the time, and I like thought about what my values are. And then every subsequent conversation, it goes, okay, what are your values? And then we talk about something else, and then we talk about goals, and then we talk about beliefs, and yeah, exactly. I feel like there's a theme that runs through all of our conversations, which is like fundamentally, what is your belief system? And my answer has always been, and this comes down to my values as well, that like I don't buy. I am not religious, but I wish I was. I really wish that I could read one book and all of a sudden believe that I had the answers to all of my questions, but I don't. I've tried that, and it doesn't work for me.
Yeah,
And
you're kind of not the type, Davis, by the way. But yeah.
I totally understand, but there is like a little bit of a jealousy there, which is it's like, oh, well, I wish that this could be all. I wish that this book could hold all of the answers for me.
I'm assuming you're not. This is a gigantic change in subject. Feel free if you have final thoughts or ideas about meditation or life or other, feel free to bring them up. I was going to ask if you were in trading at all in this market or doing anything financially, like with
So
investments.
the reason why I'm back in Canada right now is to file my taxes because I had like a tricky year last year. So I'm still filing in
Yeah.
the States, still filing in Canada, dealing with some other stuff. Um, and yeah, so honestly, I have like my few stocks that I watch like a hawk. Everything else I just kind of ignore, to be perfectly honest. So it's like I have my five darlings, two of which are just I devils, and then three of which have been pretty good for me, and then everything else is just broad-based TSX and spider indices. Um, the one thing I will say is I fundamentally don't believe that any of these tariffs are going to come through. It's so weird. It's traveling as a Canadian that kind of comes off as an American. You get into like weird conversations with people in the rest of the world, and everybody's when I first left, people were asking me how I felt about becoming the 51st state, and then when I was in Denmark, everybody wanted to talk about, not everybody, but a handful of people wanted to talk about Greenland. um I personally think that it's like, and you and I have both done negotiations as careers in the past, and it's like I think that right now, uh the US is essentially using insane anchoring as a scare tactic in order to hopefully meet somewhere in the middle. I don't necessarily think that a trade deficit weighted tariff scheme is the right one for the world's largest economy to be using, but I think it's a cute economic idea. Um, but from like a personal portfolio standpoint, um, I tell you what, I'm feeling a lot more excited about Chinese opportunities. Um,
Hmm.
I I have been I have been heavily invested in, and from a percentage basis, in Alibaba for the last 4 years. I bought the stock.
Oh.
Yeah, I bought the stock at $205 a share or something like that. And
Oh.
then, but they say losers average losers, and I've been averaging my costs back down. So I'm sitting okay there, but I feel pretty good about China's ability to kind of like weather the storm right now, especially if TSMC ends up building a factory in the States, I'd hate to work at that factory as an American, to be honest, but I think it might actually happen.
Hmm.
And then I think the trade war with Canada is a whole lot of noise right now. And for me, the saddest thing is like being on this side of the border and hearing people say like we have to buy Canadian, we can't buy American, stuff like that, because I'm going, you're punishing the wrong people at that point. It's like, if you quote unquote stop buying US, and I live like right by the US border with Washington State, is it's you're harming the small business owners that border, that run parallel to the border with Canada. You're not sending any sort of, Jeff Bezos doesn't give a shit where you get your eggs from. So I think it's better to just be neighbors and like just focus on the small problems and not pretend like we have to solve all the huge ones. Um, but yeah, I mean, I'm not buying or selling anything right now just because the VIX, I think, is at like 60, or the last time I checked was somewhere in the 60s. I think
Yeah.
that things calmed down. But it doesn't feel like I don't feel like a bubble is going to burst. I think that there's going to be some cheap buying opportunities for the next little while, but financially, I'm really not concerned about the stock market for the next 2 years, to be honest.
Yeah. No, I hear you. Um, that's interesting. So one of the things I did last December, right, is I actually kind of because especially at that time, US stocks were super expensive, right? And so, I can't help but as much as I try to get away from it, I'm still very much governed by my finance undergraduate degree, which means I somehow have to believe that the models that I learn
Hmm.
have to somehow work at some point, right? Even though they clearly, haven't been working for a very long time. There's tons of stocks that have memed and done really, really well, right? And so people like have been far more successful in those roads in many ways. But I couldn't find anything in the US. I was like, oh, I feel comfortable owning that at that multiple, right? So
Yeah.
one of the things I did is I went through every single Chinese ADR, um, just trying to find something. And actually turned out like there actually were some companies. I'm like, this is like actually a really great business, like what these guys have. So I ended up buying into them, and then actually was doing really well right up until the recent carnage.
Yeah.
And even before that, right, as the tariffs were being laid on, like these stocks were still kind of plowing through the volatility. So I was like, all right, I'll just hold it through the chop. And but then they finally got destroyed. So I didn't, I actually had a much bigger gain. I should have just sold it then. Of course, we all say that. And then, so I've sold out recently. I might end up regretting it because I think they're actually going up as of today. But until the trade war dies down, I don't feel super kind of comfortable kind of getting back into this. I'm semi worried that the US is going to just start delisting Chinese ADRs just because they want to be like that. And that's the only thing that actually worries me in the long run about this scenario. Um, because I totally agree with you. I mean, there are some real bargains and well-run businesses, in China that are publicly traded
Yeah.
at multiples that like I couldn't possibly get in the US even in a recession. I couldn't
Yeah.
get them, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it's always like, if you buy that cheap, then like you're going to make money even if the multiples don't expand, right? Like so that's from a pure value standpoint. China itself is not really cracking down the way it used to, right, on companies. So
Yeah, it's like pretty. They've signaled that they're pro business over the last year. I mean, like Jack Ma is
yeah,
out of hiding, which is amazing. And I think that like China would be doing a lot more strongly, right? I mean, not I think it's pretty obvious
yeah,
that the one thing that's hammering them right now is the talk of tariffs.
yeah, yeah. So the moment we see that reach like actual resolution, assuming that resolution, leaves room for, some kind of trade between the U.S. and China, then I do think that I would love to go back in and buy those things, right? The same stocks that I had just sold. So we'll see.
Well, I'll tell you what, something that I think is a really interesting opportunity right now, and I'm actually doing this, which is I'm watching. So, like I said, because I don't believe, for me, like the way that my brain works is it's like if I want to diversify, like for example, I everyone loves to shit on Kathy Woods all the time, right? And it's like, you know, I know it's really easy, I think, in hindsight to just say, well, you know, it was timing and luck, and she really kind of she made three really good decisions, but it's like without the right timing, without whatever, and it's like her returns over the last 10-year period have underperformed the market by like X. It's like, yeah, okay, that's fine, but like she has an opinion about what the future of technology looks like. Do you? And I'm not saying do you. I'm saying this to whomever I'm hypothetically speaking to.
Hmm.
And it's I think that she has spent a lot more time thinking about what owning each company means, not only from like a demoter and valuation standpoint, but also from a, well, what does this mean for the future of technology? If X, Y, and Z happens with artificial
Yeah.
intelligence, if Tesla is a data company, if we get autonomous vehicles, blah, 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 how do I want to be positioned? And so like I like playing the a, a technological belief in like an extreme technology growth uh, paradigm, let's say, by owning ARC. I don't necessarily need to believe everything that Kathy Woods believes, but just because I don't believe it doesn't mean it isn't right. It just is, it's not something that I spend a whole ton of time thinking about. Because I think that that's another 4 hour conversation you and I could have is like, what is actually going to be the impact on on us, on white collar jobs from artificial intelligence going forward. So let me just finish this one point because that was a bit of a tangent. So I like Kathy Wood's belief system. I do have, like I said, I got five stocks that I like actively buy and trade or buy and sell. And I have 10 that I have been thinking about and watching for uh honestly like 6 or 7 years. I added a couple a little bit more recently, but there's like let's just pretend 10. The thing that I like doing is it's like every time that there's a positive news when it comes to tariffs, I watch which stocks go up and by how much. And then when there's negative news, I watch which stocks go down and by how much. And so it's I kind of have a pretty good handle on which 10 I want to be in, depending on whether or not the tariffs go forward or come back. And so the trick now for me isn't figuring out which stocks to buy, is it's being able to have a defensible belief in which world we're about to enter and then buy the stocks that play into that world the best. And that's what I'm
Hmm.
trying to do now. I'm trying to see like what are all the micro moves of each stock every single time I get a notification of it's like, oh, 90-day extension to X, Y, and Z tariffs. And then I look at what happens to my basket and then vice versa. And I think that we've been given, and maybe I could be completely wrong. I'm sure Nassim Taleb would disagree with what I'm saying. But I think we've been given a lot of data over a short amount of time because Trump is the kind of president that floods not just the market, but like the global population with information, which is very different than how most country. But because of that, I think we've been given a ton of data over a very condensed period of time of which way the markets move based on positive news or negative news. The only so that now the question that I'm trying to figure out from a trading standpoint is which version of the future do I believe in? And then how do I align my purchases with that version of the future?
Hmm. Yeah. I do remember, I think Kathy recently did think that the tariffs also weren't going to last, right? Like they weren't going to
Yeah.
be kind of a more permanent thing. Um, yeah, we'll have to see, Davis. This is, it's funny. Like my mind keeps kind of looking for like, okay, well, I don't want to buy Chinese stocks now because I don't know when the trade war is going to end. They could get pretty cheap before,
Yeah.
or much cheaper before, it's a good time to buy again. So, like what else would I feel comfortable owning when I have no idea exactly, kind of how things are going to shake out, even if he pulls back on many of the tariffs. Um, how many countries will just enter into a trade war just because that's how they would respond, right, to
Yeah.
something like
Yeah.
this, right? Like they won't ratchet down, for example. Um, and the only thing I can keep coming back to, I'm like, I think I'd be okay with that is gold, right?
Right.
I mean, obviously, that's no secret, right? It's still going up, right?
Yeah.
When the markets crashed, it's really interesting. Gold, like Davis, did you ever buy gold before? Have you ever thought about trading gold, or do you have any experience in it?
No, not personally.
Okay. Me neither, actually, because I can't recall a time before where I was like, this makes sense, right?
Yeah,
Like there's and what I am aware of is for the longest time, like for example, if you try to do a YouTube search about gold, what you discover if you watch this long enough is there's like a group of people whose life is gold, right?
yeah,
Like that's and then they keep talking about how gold is the best investment to buy, but in order to make that narrative make sense, it's always that, the financial system is about to collapse.
yeah,
Like it's always like, a geopolitical something, or like something has to go wrong for
yeah,
you to think that gold is the right thing to buy. And then what I basically found out is half of these people are basically working for gold firms of some kind. So they're there
yeah.
to kind of market, and they market through fear, right? So, huge percentage of the time, not a great idea to listen to these folks. They're not part of mainstream finance. Like you don't see them on CNBC or Bloomberg, for example.
Yeah, it's a underground bunker is either the worst purchase in the entire world or it is absolutely the best purchase of the entire world. It's
Yeah.
that's the kind of world that we're playing in.
Yeah, that's exactly the thing. So watching YouTube videos by these people pitching gold isn't helpful, right? At the end of the day, if you're trying to get kind of objective, kind of solid thinking. So that was always kind of how I understood gold. And then like more recently started to kind of look into it. And this is how much of an amateur I am at it. Apparently, right? I've learned this the hard way because I've been buying gold for a while now. But when the market started to crash, actually gold went down. And I was like, WTF, how is that possible? The point of the gold trade is that it's actually supposed to go in the opposite direction, right?
Mhm.
And then, of course, where do I get my answer from? Because I can't get it from the YouTubers, right? Because they're so biased. So I asked ChatGPT, and I just should have asked the ChatGPT this question long before. Turns out every time when a crisis hits, gold actually goes down initially up
Mhm.
to a period of like 1 to 2, maybe 3 weeks. And then it will actually take off afterwards. So it does work, but not initially because of all the guys getting smacked with margin calls and all that kind of stuff, right?
Okay. Yeah.
So ironically, that first crash is probably a good time to buy gold if you think the crisis is really kind of taken off. So
Interesting.
yeah, and so what we've seen, when the initial kind of stock market crashes hit, like you'll see the gold price. You can look at GLD as the ETF version of it. Actually went down a fair amount, but it hasn't been for 2 or 3 weeks, or at least it's bounced back pretty fast. Uh, can always go down, right? I might be wrong, but I have a sneaking suspicion that there's actually a fair amount of demand for gold at the moment, kicking in with central banks and everybody else kind of wondering how they're going to solve the budget deficit problem and all that other fun stuff on top of this.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's interesting. I do not look at gold. I think that that's super interesting.
Yeah, it's not a recommendation, right? I mean,
No,
I
hey,
definitely
listen,
did buy some, but yeah.
I'm gonna take a look at that because yeah, I've never I think my brain can handle maybe an 11th stock to take a look at and if it
I
fits
mean,
the
I
risk.
don't know if any of your if the finance profs you know well at NYU have any thoughts on gold at the moment, right? It doesn't tend to fit in any standard economic models, so it's sort of its own thing, right?
So the only thing I'll say is I remember a guy named Dar who I think is like he was one of my absolute favorite professors. I took his class. It was systematic investing, and it was like a maths based approach to day trading essentially. Um, and he essentially showed us a portfolio that was volatility weighted, but it was approximately 70/30 S&P 500 and gold that hit like a point 0.7 Sharpe ratio pretty reasonably. It hit a point 0.7 Sharpe ratio though with low returns but extremely low volatility,
Hmm.
specifically because it had like the volatility weighting of how much equity versus how much gold you had in the S&P 500, and those typically travel in the opposite directions. So it was interesting, but he was like, it's not an exciting S&P, it's not an exciting zero point 0.7 Sharpe ratio, but I mean, it's with that low of volatility, you can like leverage the hell out of it and actually make a lot of money. So that I remember that class and it was like pretty interesting, but and yeah, like I said, the Coles notes is it was approximately 70-30. There might have been some sort of leverage in it in order to get to that zero point 0.7 Sharpe ratio, but you can do exciting things with like a two asset
Yeah.
portfolio as long as they're moving in the right directions.
Yeah, yeah, that all makes sense to me, and it's true. I mean, generally, gold doesn't move aggressively, even when I feel like it should, right? Like the VIX will move aggressively, right, when the
Yeah.
market crashes. But from what I've seen from gold, at least so far, gold is also interesting because it's a little bit of it's got some option value on if the budget deficit essentially goes completely unsolved, and if you ever get a moment where Treasury demand actually collapses then the Fed will have to buy all the bonds that nobody wants, right, in order to kind of prop up. And that essentially means money printing. And if that loss of confidence kicks in, it'd be hard to imagine gold staying at the same price, right? Just because the dollar gets devalued essentially at that point.
So the funny thing is, you're coming at this from your standpoint, and then I said everything that I said earlier from my standpoint, but we're saying the same thing, which is it's like we're essentially going back to fundamentals, or and it doesn't matter if it's philosophical or if it's just in like everyday commerce and world economy. Is it's when you're looking at like the insanity that is like the modern day stock market and like extreme volatility, a president who makes the market essentially fluctuate 3,000 points in a morning. Yeah, okay. So what were they doing 2,000, 5,000, or maybe not 5,000, but what were they doing 2,000 years ago? What was their currency? What were they relying on as an agent of value? And it's like,
Mm,
yeah, I think that gold the reason why I wrote it down and I will actually look at that ETF is it's because gold plays more into my overarching philosophy right now than any of the other stocks that I'm looking at. It's I don't need to really believe in whether or not we're going to have autonomous vehicles in order to believe that gold is and was and pretty much has always been a store of value. In the same way that I believe that the books that have lasted the last 2,000, 3,000 years are a store of knowledge in a way that the happiness advantage at JFK's the whatever it is, the reply at JFK was trying to tell me it was 10 years ago. So
yeah.
yeah, like I said, it seems like two completely different tangents, but I think that it comes from the same core, which is a bit of a you got to look a little when right now feels too volatile from an emotional, intellectual, from a financial standpoint get your bearings 2,000 years ago and then start to look at what's happening today with new eyes.